This is a quick video on showing you how to use a stored config file to switch between configs quickly on a router with a reboot. There's lots of ways to do this. This tends to be the simpler. So I have a router here. It's a virtual router, but it works the same. And I'm going to show you in my flash, I have the standard stuff on this particular router. And I have a show run, which is my running config. And it has things like an interface on 192.168, a LAN interface on a 10.10, some routes in it, etc. So what we're going to do is, if I show the start, which is the startup config on the disk, it should match exactly the running config, and it does. And that's because you copy run to start to store it, so that every time you reboot the router, it comes up with the same configuration, and it stores it on the disk. What we're going to do is we're going to copy, use the copy command to make some copies of these configs. You can't just copy a config into running memory because it merges what's in the config file with what's in running RAM. It doesn't overwrite it all and erase everything unless you write specific commands to do so. So I found, some people will save copies on their disk of configs and say copy flash my config into running memory, and it doesn't work that way. It merges, so that's the problem. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the saved config. So we're going to copy start, which is actually startup config, to flash to config 1. That's it. So I'm going to do a dir, and we can see we have a config 1 file there, second to last file. Point at it with my mouse right here. And then I'm going to change some things here in this config. The first thing I want to do is change the router name. Let's do this. Config T host name router 2. Let's do a show run and see what we can do with some other changes here. Let's change the interface IPs. That would be intgig 1 IP address 192.168.2 dot, let's say 200. So we'll make that different. Intgig 2 IP address 10.11.11.11. So we've changed a few things. Let's just assume you're testing different configurations. And do show run pipe include IP route. And I'm going to change these two routes as well. No IP route zeros. It's the default route, 192.168.1.20. Take that out, put in a new route, IP route that's on that same subnet that would actually function, 192.168.2 dot, let's say 1. And then I'm going to take out the other route, no IP route 172.16.1.0, and this was just an example of some commands that you might have in your router just to show some differences. And let's just say there's a different route for this one through the 10.11.11.100, whatever. So now I've got a different show run, different router name, different IP interfaces, different routes. If I show start, the start's still the original router it booted with, router 1, with the original IP addresses. So what I'm going to do is the running config is a second different config now. So I'm going to copy run to flash config 2. Now we have two different configs in my flash. Config 1 has the router 1 name and the 192.168.1 dot address on the outside and the 10.10.10 address on the inside, and the routes appropriate for that. Config 2 has the one that you're currently looking at, what it is called router 2. It's got a 192.168.2 dot on the outside, and it's got a 10.11.11 address on the inside with appropriate routes. And the way you can switch between them is using the startup. So if I copy flash config 1 to start, and I let it write, and I reload, when I reload, if it asks you to save your config, say no. Mine didn't ask, but if it does, we don't want it because we want it to load what's in that startup config now that we copied config 1 in. And it should load with config 1 completely from scratch and be under configuration 1. the router came up all by itself under router 1, and I can see my IP addresses have changed to that appropriate config. I can see my routes are correct for that network, and my router is called router 1. If I do a dir, I can see config 1 and 2 are still there, haven't been touched. So if I want to switch to the other config, I just copy flash config 2, the one I want, into start. Rewrite it and reload. And again, I'll let that boot, and I'll pause this so you don't have to wait for it. Reboot, we're on router 2, and I'll log in here. Show IP in brief. You can see we're on the other IPs. Sure run pipe include IP route. See, we have the correct routes for this, and it's called router 2. So that's how you can switch back and forth fairly quickly. Now, if I needed to edit one of the configs, the easiest way to do it is boot the config. So let's pretend we're going to edit router 2 config, and we're going to add another route here. So I would set it to router 2 by copying router 2's config into the start and rebooting. Now I'll make my change. Let's just say we're doing another route inside. Let's say 172.16.3.0 through 10.11.11, let's see, 22. And then rather than write mem I'm going to copy run to flash config. This one was called config 2. And if I do a dir, I still have my config 1 and my config 2, but now my config 2 has the extra route command in it. So when I use it, it'll have that extra route command. Always just copy whichever config file you want to be the startup one into start, and it'll always work. Now if you want to see what's in that text file, you can display it with a more command, flash config 2. And you can actually see what's in that file. And we can see it does in fact have the additional route right here. And our 2 config files are there. So hopefully that'll give you a quick way of storing some configs, and obviously leave the one in startup that you want to run every time this machine boots.